Welcome to Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum's 5th Virtual Speaker Series of 2020. Tonight we'll hear from Marika Arksey. Marika is JPPM's Assistant Director and has worked with archaeological collections and on archaeological investigations in North America, Central America, and Europe. Coming to us most recently from Wyoming, tonight Marika will discuss her work in the Black Hills of northeastern Wyoming, investigating prehistoric bison hunting. She'll provide a background on how indigenous groups hunted bison in the region, talk about the work she did, and discuss how the project involved the local community.
Hello, and thank you for joining me tonight as we explore a bit of the history of bison hunting in North America and how one of the sites I worked on in Wyoming fits into this story. Over the course of more than 10,000 years in North America, Native American hunters developed many subsistence strategies, including hunting large mammals such as bison. These different strategies vary depending on the environment and landscape, available technology, and the culture and social relationships between groups. The purposes of large-scale hunting were not just for subsistence, though the collection of food and materials was certainly a primary goal. Large-scale hunts involved an in-depth knowledge and familiarity of bison herd behavior, migration paths, and the landscape. They also required a lot of organization and collaboration, with groups of people coming together at certain times of the year to work together to take down these large animals. Coming together for these hunts provided groups the additional opportunities for trade, sharing knowledge, political alliances, spiritual practices, and forming new familial bonds. Native American hunters had several large-scale kill techniques, including arroyo traps, dune traps, corrals, and jumps. Many of these techniques were developed by the end of the Younger Dryas period, about 12,900 to 11,500 years ago, when climate conditions returned to being glacial after a period of gradual warming. During this short period of just over 1,000 years, vegetation changed rapidly, climate patterns shifted and varied widely across North America, and many of the large megafauna, such as the mammoth, went extinct. It was at the end of this period, when things warmed up again, that these large-scale kills began to take off. And by about 5,000 years ago, all of these techniques were widely employed from Canada all the way down to Texas. Natural traps and corrals are among the earliest evidence for large-scale bison kills in North America. The basic concept for each is the same. Herd the bison towards a small, enclosed dead end and kill the trapped animals like shooting fish in a barrel. Arroyos or box canyons formed great natural trapping opportunities. When such natural features weren't available, constructed corrals made of poles or rocks and willow served the purpose just fine. Jumps became popular later than traps. To make effective use of the bison jump strategy, large groups of people would herd or direct the bison for several miles, forcing them into a stampede that drove them over a cliff. If the cliff was high enough or had a steep enough slope to it, the bison would break limbs when they fell, making them immobile and easier to kill at the base. Or they could be killed by the fall itself. While this technique didn't become as widespread as trapping until later, jumps are among the earliest bison kill sites in North America, and lasted up until, and in some cases slightly beyond, the times of earliest European contact. Jump sites are often identified by lines of rock cairns or piles of rocks, which created drive lines at the final stretch of the herd path and leading up to the cliff edge. Some drive lines can stretch for miles. Others can be as short as 100 yards. These rock cairns may have been used to hold poles with flags or waving pieces of cloth or hide to keep the bison in line with the desired area of the cliff. The oldest evidence of bison hunting is actually a jump. The site of Bonfire Shelter in Texas is the oldest and southernmost bison jump site in North America. It was only used a couple times, thousands of years apart. It was first used about 11,700 years ago, at the end of the Younger Dryas period, with archaeologists having found at least 3 distinct bone beds containing a now extinct species of large bison, Bison antiquus, dating to this period. It was then used once again about 2,800 years ago, where archaeologists found remains of an older version of our modern bison. These two time periods were among the very few times that this part of Texas had the vegetation to support bison. While older bone beds have been found in the site, these bone beds do not contain any solid evidence that humans were involved in their deaths, such as stone tools, butchering, or cut marks on the bones. These older bones did have some breakage patterns to them, though, that might indicate that humans were at least present and making use of the dead animals, even if they may not have been directly responsible for their deaths. While not one of the oldest bison jumps or kill sites, the one that most people are going to be familiar with if they've heard of bison jumps is Head Smashed Inn in Canada. This jump is one of the older bison jump sites in North America, dating to around 5,500 years ago, and is now a well-developed UNESCO World Heritage Site. At this site, bison were herded off of the 36-foot-high cliff from their grazing area 2 miles away, aided by the use of drivelines formed by rock cairns. After falling off the cliff, bison carcasses were processed at a nearby camp. This site was used on and off again over the course of 5,000 years until the 19th century. In the 16th century, North America contained somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 to 30 million bison. They were hunted almost to extinction in the 19th century due to numerous factors, including a drastically changing economy in which Europeans placed a high value on bison fur. In the winter of 1872 to 1873, more than 1.5 million bison were shipped east as part of this trade. Most of the last large bison hunts by Native American and indigenous groups in North America took place in the late 1870s and 1880s. Less than 100 bison remained in the wild by the late 1880s, but more and more conservation efforts are starting to reintroduce bison populations to many areas in North America, including national parks and tribal lands. Northeast Wyoming, particularly the corner I'm going to talk more about, is part of the Great Plains of North America. Over the course of the more than 10,000 years of occupation of this area, hunting strategies, preferred habitation zones, and social dynamics changed frequently to accommodate periods of cooling, warming, drought, changes in available vegetation, game, and other resources. After a period of droughts about 8,000 to 7,000 years ago, game increased in this area of Wyoming, and bison hunting became a common practice in what became a relatively rich and topographically ideal location. The Hawkins site is an example of a classic arroyo trap kill site. With the increasingly steep slopes to the sides of the canyons and the nearby grazing grounds, herding bison into the ends of this arroyo would have been relatively straightforward. Radiocarbon dates indicate that the site is about 6,500 years old, and the bison remains found there were larger than modern bison, but smaller than the Bison antiqua species found at Bonfire Shelter 10,000 years ago. They have been classified as an intermediary species, Bison occidentalis. Lithics from the Hawkins site seem to indicate that hunters included several small groups from around the Black Hills. In Wyoming, bison jumping as opposed to trapping begins late in prehistory, slightly prior to Euro-American contact in eastern North America. There is presently little to no evidence for bison jumping that predates AD 1400 in Wyoming. This change in hunting strategy in Wyoming to include jumps at this point in history coincides with the migration of indigenous populations living in the Great Lakes and Great Basin regions into the Great Plains, starting around AD 1500, during the 200-year period known as the Little Ice Age, in which the habitation patterns of bison changed yet again. Some of the groups that moved into this northeast portion of Wyoming included the Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, Kiowa, Plains Apache, and the Shoshone. The Vore site is a sinkhole 25 miles northeast of the Hawkins site, and it was used as a bison jump from about 1550 to the late 1700s, when horses and guns made this type of hunting obsolete. The Jump is a unique bison mass procurement site where hunters came from as far away as North Dakota, Montana, and southeast Wyoming to congregate and collaborate to kill hundreds of bison at a time by stampeding them into the sinkhole. Bison bones, projectile points, and stone tools were unearthed to a depth of about 15 feet. Driveline remnants are present nearby and may have been used to direct bison towards the sinkhole. The unique depositional environment of the sinkhole resulted in stratification, or layering of cultural and natural material, which has enabled archaeologists to identify 22 distinct bone beds. Researchers estimate that on average, 225 bison were killed per hunt at the site, which therefore holds the remains of at least 5,000 bison, and perhaps as many as 10,000. The late use of the Vor site, which overlaps the proto-historic period of this region, the excellent site preservation, and the extent of the collections recovered from this site make the Vor Buffalo Jump a unique site. The site is a well-developed educational and tourism facility, with portions of the excavation open and preserved for visitors to learn more about the archaeological process. In 2016, the Office of the Wyoming State Archaeologist, or OWSA, continued the previous research in this area by expanding survey to include more and more private and state land around the Vor site. This larger landscape approach to the region was chosen to attempt to better understand how these sites were integrated into subsistence strategies of the Plains tribes, and how subsistence use changed throughout a period of time that saw the introduction of European culture and tool types. While there are hundreds of identified sites in the Black Hills National Forests surrounding this area, the private properties and ranches of the valley itself have yet to be comprehensively investigated, leading to a disparity in data collection that gives the impression that most occupation or campsites are in the hills. Initial investigations by OWSA in 2016 and 2017 aimed to identify sites in this area in order to create a data set with which to address these disparities. During the 2017 field season, at the request of a local property owner, OWSA recorded a possible bison jump about 5 miles northeast of the Vor site. Drive lines on top of the cliff formed of very small rock cairns, and a bone bed were identified. In the 2018 field season, OWSA returned to the site to conduct a small investigation to attempt to confirm that the bone bed was identified was actually bison and not cow from the ranch, that it is a cultural bone bed caused by a human-driven bison jump and not a natural bone bed due to accidental falls, and to hope to get a date on the jump event. A small 1 meter by 2 meter excavation unit was opened, and we made it down about 80 centimeters, just far enough to see the tops of 2 bison skulls, when weather made the fields too wet to continue driving over, and our access to the site was cut short for the year. It was just enough to confirm that at least the site contained bison, and we officially named the site the Courchain site, after the property owner Rocky Courchain. Rocky has been invaluable in supporting our research in this area of Wyoming, due in large part to his enthusiasm for archaeology, but also his position as director of the Crook County Museum in Sundance, and his connections to all the local ranchers and collectors. With Rocky's encouragement, we returned again in 2019 with a different approach to the site through a neighboring property, and thanks to the gracious lending of his ATV to bring our equipment back and forth across a slightly precarious and very informal path to the site. Knowing that we had a fairly accessible site, we were close to a town, and we were at a site as exciting as a new bison jump, we turned this 2019 project into one of our avocational training program courses. To do this, we were joined by an archaeologist with the State Historic Preservation Office, and had 3 amazing and incredibly hardworking student interns join us to help with the work and to train our volunteers. In addition to our 3 volunteers, we were joined by the assistant curator for the state's archaeological repository and her daughter, who's been working on archaeology sites in Wyoming since she was 8 and had joined us on previous projects. A few of our regular volunteers who had been with us on other projects, some local volunteers who heard about us being in town and tracked us down, a professional archaeologist in the area who saw our social media posts about the project and contacted us on Instagram, and some of the local Black Hills National Forest archaeologists who came out on their long weekend to dig a fun site. The avocational volunteers got to be there from the beginning, taking on setting up units, excavating, mapping, casting, screening, and filling out data sheets and forms. Everyone had a great time, learned a lot, and got some valuable hands-on experience. In the end, it was our interns who put in the final and exhausting 12-hour days, one with horribly sunburnt feet, to get the site wrapped up after the volunteers had to leave. Over the course of those 10 days, we reopened the 2018 excavation unit and an additional 1x1 meter unit to make sure that we'd be able to capture the skulls we knew were there. Because it was so far down from the surface, we also lowered the other 1 meter by 1 meter unit in this area to just above where we knew the bone bed to be located, to provide us and the volunteers with a step to get in and out of the excavation safely. We continued the excavation until we ran out of time, closing it just beyond 1 meter below the surface, at a depth that coincided with a tapering off of the density of bones. In total, we identified 6 skulls within the 1 meter by 2 meter unit, numerous vertebrae and ribs, several mandibles, and a few lower accounts of several other bone types. All were bison. We didn't find any stone tools or flakes from retouching any tools, though. Because of the depositional process in this area, including massive runoff events from the cliff that show up as red layers of soil, combined with flooding events from the nearby year-round and spring-fed creek that show up as grayish-brown, the bone layer that we came down on was not as clearly defined as those at Vor, and the bone appeared to have been jumbled and moved around from where it may have originally been deposited. They were dispersed throughout a 30-centimeter depth of bone. There was no clearly identified surface upon which they may have been resting when they were first deposited. More intact skulls are on the larger end of bison, larger than those from the Vor site that were locally on display down the road. Many of the skulls and some of the articulated bones, such as the portion of the vertebral column that was found, were cast at the site so they could be brought back to the lab and more carefully excavated than time and conditions permitted. Preliminary visual inspection of the bones as they were being excavated indicated that some of them may have breakage patterns consistent with human intervention, but due to the muddy matrix we were working in, the bones were not able to be cleaned until they got back to the lab. This lab work unfortunately got put on hold due to COVID, and the bones have yet to be fully analyzed. But we were able to get a bone sample sent off for radiocarbon dating. The carbon date provided a much more recent date than anyone was expecting based on the sizes of the skulls and the depth below ground surface. The bone returned a date of between 1728 and 1810 AD, at the tail end of the use of the Vor bison jump, and nearing the very end of the use of jumps entirely. Should it date beyond the last use of Vor, it would be one of the last used bison jumps in Wyoming. Because there are some complications with radiocarbon dating in this particular time period, and the range of dates that are also possible, there are plans to redate another portion of one of the skulls, along with a tooth, to attempt to confirm this date. While most people tend to hope that their find will be the oldest of something ever found, there is something to be said for finding the youngest, or the last used as well. This period of history is incredibly complex, with a lot of cultural and technological changes happening very quickly. Further investigation of this site could provide a lot of insight into how the people living in this area were handling these changes, how they adapted, and how they may have resisted them. Because of this site's connection to the community, demonstrated by the outpouring of volunteer and local support, this site will eventually be put on display at the Crook County Museum. There was one skull in particular that everyone at the site, including the site owner Rocky and his neighbor, took a shine to. The largest of the skulls in the center of the unit, found facing upwards, and who kept a close eye on us the entire time. We named this skull Zool, and Rocky has decided he wants to build a display in the museum, now being relocated to a beautifully restored historic schoolhouse, around this skull and the site to complement the displays they already have that feature the hawk and arroyo trap and the Vor bison jump sites. While full analysis of the bone wasn't able to be completed, students in the public archaeology taught that fall decided to take on the task of preparing this skull for display and working with Rocky on developing some exhibit narrative based on what we knew thus far. These students were in touch with Rocky, learned how to remove bone from a cast, spot treat it for any mildew that may have formed between casting and in-lab excavation, photography, data entry, and some minor consolidation. All of this while developing an appreciation for other aspects of archaeology that many students don't always get to engage with, such as curation, exhibit development, community engagement, outreach, education, and consultation. Thank you for tuning into this overview of bison hunting and for following along with our very preliminary results of the work at the Courchaine Bison Jump. If you'd like to learn more, please let us know by contacting Jefferson Patterson on any of our social media platforms or find us online through our website. I'd like to end with a final and huge thank you to everyone that has supported the work at the Courchaine Bison Jump.
Thank you all for joining us for tonight's presentation. Next month, we'll hear from Sarah Rivers Cofield, JPPM's Curator of Federal Collections at the Mac Lab. Sarah's presentation, Equestrian Artifacts of the English Tobacco Colonies, Identification, Manufacturing, Trade, and Interpretation, will discuss how bridle and saddle hardware can inform us about the relationships between colonists and their horses. Again, thank you and see you next month.